Before we begin this incredible story, I'll please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our amazing emotional stories. Now let's dive into this unbelievable tale from Buckingham Palace. The morning fog settled thick over London as Thomas Whitaker arrived for his shift at Buckingham Palace. He had been a royal guard for 12 years, standing motionless in his red uniform and tall bearskin hat. People took photos of him every day, trying to make him smile or move. But Thomas never broke. He was trained to be like a statue, no matter what happened around him. Thomas was 42 years old with a strong build and gray eyes that had seen many things over the years. He came from a family of military men. His father served the Queen, and his grandfather before that. Being a royal guard was not just a job for Thomas. It was his life, his pride, and his duty. He took his position very seriously and never questioned the rules. That Tuesday morning seemed like any other day. Thomas put on his uniform carefully, checking every button and making sure his boots were perfectly polished. His wife Sarah kissed him goodbye at the door of their small flat in South London. She was used to his long shifts and serious nature. Their 2 children, Emma and James, were already at school. Thomas walked to the underground station and took the train to work, just like he did every day. When he arrived at the palace, the sky was gray and cloudy. The usual crowd of tourists had not yet gathered. Thomas nodded to his fellow guards as he took his position near the east entrance. This was a quieter post than the main gates. Fewer people walked by, which meant fewer distractions. He stood straight, placed his rifle at his side, and became as still as stone. Hours passed slowly. Thomas was trained to ignore discomfort. His legs did not ache even though he stood without moving. His mind was clear and focused. He watched everything with careful eyes. A delivery van arrived. 2 maids walked past carrying fresh linens. A gardener pushed a wheelbarrow full of tools toward the palace gardens. Everything was normal and routine. Around midday, Thomas noticed something unusual. A door near his post opened slightly. It was a service entrance that staff used to move between buildings. The door was always kept locked from the inside. Thomas knew this because he had guarded this spot for 3 years. The door should not be opening on its own. He remained perfectly still, but his eyes focused on the door. It creaked open a few more inches. Thomas expected to see a staff member step out, but nobody came. The door just stayed open, swaying gently in the breeze. This was strange. Palace rules were very strict about security. All doors had to be closed and locked at all times. Thomas felt a small alarm in his chest, but he did not move. Guards were not supposed to leave their posts unless something was clearly wrong. An open door was unusual, but perhaps someone would come and close it soon. He waited and watched carefully. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The door remained open. No staff member appeared to close it. Thomas began to feel that something was not right. He could see darkness beyond the doorway. The hallway inside looked empty. But why would the door be left open like this? According to protocol, Thomas should report this to his supervisor through his radio. But he hesitated. What if this was nothing? What if a maintenance worker had just forgotten to close the door properly? He did not want to sound an alarm for something small. The other guards would think he was being paranoid. Thomas had a reputation for being calm and steady. He did not want to lose that over an open door. Another 15 minutes went by. Still, nobody came to close the door. Now Thomas was certain something was wrong. He broke his stance and reached for his radio. But just as his hand touched the device on his belt, he heard something. It was very faint. A sound that made his blood run cold. It was crying. Someone inside the palace was crying. Not the normal sound of a sad person, but desperate sobbing. The kind of crying that came from fear or pain. The sound drifted out through the open door. Barely reaching Thomas where he stood, his training told him to call for backup immediately. But something else pushed him forward. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help right now? Every second could matter. Thomas looked around quickly. No tourists were nearby. No other guards could see this entrance. He made a decision that would change everything. Thomas stepped away from his post and moved toward the open door. His heart pounded as he broke the most important rule. A royal guard never leaves his position, never. But the crying continued, weak and desperate. He could not ignore it. He reached the doorway and peered inside. The hallway was dimly lit with old lights that barely worked. The walls were plain stone, not the decorated corridors that tourists saw. This was the working part of the palace, where staff moved supplies and did repairs. The crying was coming from somewhere deeper inside. Thomas stepped through the doorway. The door swung shut behind him with a heavy click. He tried the handle. It was locked. His stomach dropped. He was now trapped inside, away from his post, with no way to go back. The crying grew louder, pulling him forward into the darkness of the palace's hidden corridors. Thomas stood in the dim hallway, his training fighting against his instincts. The locked door behind him meant he had no choice but to move forward. The crying sound echoed off the stone walls, making it hard to tell exactly where it came from. He gripped his rifle tighter and started walking slowly down the corridor. The passage was narrow and cold. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some dripping water onto the floor. Thomas had never been in this part of the palace before. Guards stayed in their assigned areas. The working corridors were for staff only. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung in the corners. It was clear that not many people used this passage. As he walked deeper, the crying became clearer. It was a child. Thomas felt his chest tighten. A child was crying somewhere in these forgotten hallways of Buckingham Palace. Why would a child be here? The palace had strict security. Every visitor was checked and monitored. Staff members had to show identification. Children did not just wander into restricted areas. Thomas reached a corner and stopped. He listened carefully. The crying was coming from the left. He turned and saw another long hallway stretching ahead. There were doors on both sides, all closed. Old storage rooms, probably? Places where the palace kept things nobody needed anymore. He tried the first door. Locked. The second door was the same. The crying got louder as he moved down the hall. It was definitely coming from one of these rooms. Thomas felt sweat on his forehead despite the cold air. What was he going to find? The fourth door handle turned when he tried it. The crying immediately stopped. Thomas froze. The sudden silence was almost worse than the crying. He pushed the door open slowly, his hand shaking slightly. The room inside was dark, except for a thin line of light coming from a crack in the boarded window. Thomas stepped inside. The room smelled of old wood and damp stone. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw furniture covered with white sheets. Old paintings leaned against the walls. Broken chairs were stacked in one corner. This was definitely a storage room for things the palace no longer used. Then he saw movement. In the far corner, behind a covered table, something shifted. Thomas raised his rifle, his heart hammering. He called out in his most commanding voice, trying to sound calm and in control. He announced that he was a royal guard, and whoever was there should show themselves immediately. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly a small figure emerged from behind the table. It was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. He had dark, messy hair and wore dirty clothes that looked too big for him. His face was streaked with tears and dirt. He stared at Thomas with wide, terrified eyes. Thomas lowered his rifle immediately. The child looked absolutely terrified. His whole body was shaking. Thomas spoke softly, telling the boy that he was not going to hurt him. He asked the boy his name and what he was doing here. The boy did not answer. He just stared at Thomas like he was seeing a ghost. Then the child did something unexpected. He held up his hands in front of his face, as if protecting himself from a blow. Thomas saw bruises on the boy's thin arms. Dark purple marks that looked recent. His stomach turned. Thomas knelt down slowly to appear less threatening. He set his rifle carefully on the ground beside him. He spoke in the gentle voice he used with his own children. He told the boy that he was safe now, and nobody was going to hurt him. He asked again for the boy's name. The boy's lips trembled. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said his name was Daniel. Thomas asked where his parents were. Daniel's eyes filled with fresh tears. He said he did not know. He said he had been locked in this room for a long time. He was hungry and cold and scared. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. Someone had locked this child in here. Someone had hurt him and left him alone in the dark. He asked Daniel who brought him here. The boy started crying again and shook his head. He seemed too frightened to answer. Thomas pulled out his radio to call for help. But before he could speak into it, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy boots on stone? Someone was coming. Daniel heard them too. His eyes went huge with terror. He scrambled backward into the corner, shaking his head frantically and whispering, "Please no, please no." The footsteps got closer. Thomas stood up quickly and grabbed his rifle. His mind raced. If this was palace security responding to his absence from his post, that would be fine. He could explain everything. But something about Daniel's reaction made him think otherwise. The child was absolutely terrified of whoever was coming. Thomas moved to stand between Daniel and the door. The footsteps stopped right outside. A shadow fell across the doorway. Then a voice called out. It was not a security guard. It was a woman's voice, cold and sharp. She demanded to know who was in the room. Thomas recognized that voice. His blood went cold. It was Lady Margaret Thornhill, one of the palace's senior household managers. She had worked at the palace for over 20 years and was known for being strict and proper. She managed staff, handled palace protocols, and reported directly to the royal household administration. Why would she be down here in these forgotten corridors? Lady Thornhill stepped into the doorway. She was a tall woman in her 50s, always dressed perfectly in expensive suits. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly. When she saw Thomas standing there with Daniel, her face went white. Then immediately her expression changed to anger. She demanded to know what Thomas was doing away from his post. She said he had broken protocol and would face serious consequences. Her voice was sharp and commanding. But Thomas noticed something else. Her eyes kept darting to Daniel. She looked worried. Not angry that a lost child had been found, but worried that someone had discovered something they should not have. Thomas stood his ground. He asked Lady Thornhill what this child was doing locked in a storage room. He pointed to Daniel's bruises and his terrified state. He said this boy needed medical attention and his parents needed to be contacted immediately. Lady Thornhill's face became like stone. She stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her. The click of the door shutting made Daniel whimper. She spoke in a low, dangerous voice. She told Thomas he had made a terrible mistake. She said he had stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. She ordered him to hand over Daniel and return to his post immediately. She said if he did this now and stayed quiet, nothing bad would happen to his career or his family. That last word hung in the air. Family. It was a threat. Thomas felt ice in his veins. Lady Thornhill knew about Sarah, Emma, and James. She was telling him to walk away, or his family would suffer. But as he looked at Daniel's terrified face and the bruises on his arms, Thomas knew he could not do that. Something very wrong was happening in Buckingham Palace, and he had just discovered it. Thomas looked Lady Thornhill straight in the eyes. He said he was not going anywhere without Daniel. He said this child needed help, and he was going to make sure he got it. His voice was steady, but inside, his heart was racing. He knew he was challenging someone with real power in the palace, but he also knew what was right. Lady Thornhill's expression turned even colder. She crossed her arms and studied Thomas carefully. Then she did something strange. She glanced at her watch and seemed to relax slightly. She told Thomas that he had no idea what he had gotten himself into. She said if he insisted on being difficult, she would have to show him the truth. Thomas did not understand what she meant. Lady Thornhill walked to the door and locked it from the inside. She put the key in her pocket. Then she turned back to Thomas and Daniel. She said that since Thomas would not leave quietly, she had no choice but to explain everything. But first, he needed to understand one important thing. Nothing that happened in this room could ever leave these walls. She began to tell a story that made Thomas's blood run cold. Lady Thornhill explained that Buckingham Palace had secrets that went back decades. Hidden programs that nobody outside a small group knew about. She said Daniel was not the first child to be kept in these forgotten corridors. There had been others over the years. Thomas could not believe what he was hearing. He asked why children were being held in the palace. Lady Thornhill said it was complicated. She claimed these children had no families, no homes, nowhere else to go. She said they were being protected, kept safe from the dangerous world outside. But Daniel's bruises told a different story. Thomas said that keeping a child locked in a dark room was not protection. It was abuse. He demanded to know who else was involved in this. Lady Thornhill smiled coldly. She said people much more important than him were part of this arrangement. People who could destroy his life with a single phone call. Thomas felt trapped. He looked at Daniel, who was still pressed against the wall in terror. The boy was so thin and pale. How long had he been down here? Thomas asked Lady Thornhill directly how long Daniel had been locked up. She checked her watch again, which Thomas found odd. She said Daniel had been in the palace for 3 months. 3 months. This child had been held in these cold, dark corridors for 3 months, while Thomas stood guard outside. While tourists took photos and laughed. While the royal family went about their business. It made him feel sick. He asked what happened to the other children Lady Thornhill mentioned. She did not answer that question. Instead, she said time was up. She told Thomas he had 2 choices. He could forget everything he saw here, return to his post, and continue his life safely. Or he could try to be a hero and face the consequences. She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo. It was his daughter Emma leaving school that afternoon. The message was clear. Thomas felt rage building inside him. But he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to think clearly. Lady Thornhill had power and connections. She had people watching his family. If he tried to fight her directly, he would lose. But he could not just leave Daniel here. The boy was counting on him. For the first time in months, someone had found him. Someone who might help. He made a decision. Thomas told Lady Thornhill he would cooperate, but he wanted to understand everything first. He said if these children were really being protected as she claimed, then she should not mind explaining the whole operation to him. He spoke calmly, pretending to be convinced by her threats. Lady Thornhill studied his face, trying to determine if he was lying. Finally, she nodded. She said she would show him the full scope of what happened down here. But he would have to come with her, and he would have to leave his rifle behind. Thomas agreed. He set down his weapon and moved away from Daniel. The boy made a small sound of fear, but Thomas gave him a look that he hoped said, "Trust me." Lady Thornhill unlocked the door and led Thomas out into the corridor. She locked Daniel back in the room. Thomas's hands clenched into fists, but he followed her without argument. They walked deeper into the maze of forgotten hallways. The passages got older and darker as they went. Some of the lights did not work at all. Thomas tried to memorize the path, counting turns and noting landmarks. After several minutes, Lady Thornhill stopped at a heavy wooden door. She pulled out a different key and unlocked it. The door opened to reveal stone steps going down, a basement level. Thomas had not even known the palace had accessible basements. The smell that came up from below was stale and musty. They descended the steps carefully. At the bottom was another corridor, even older than the ones above. The walls were rough stone and the ceiling was low. This part of the palace was probably hundreds of years old. Lady Thornhill led him to a large room at the end of the passage. She turned on a light. What Thomas saw made his heart stop. The room was set up like a dormitory. There were 6 small beds lined up against one wall. Each bed had thin blankets and flat pillows. A table in the center held plates and cups, but what shocked Thomas most were the children. 4 children sat at the table, staring at him with hollow eyes. They ranged in age from about 6 to 12 years old. All of them looked thin and pale. All of them had bruises or marks on their visible skin. They wore simple gray clothes that looked institutional. None of them spoke or moved. They just watched him with empty expressions that broke his heart. Lady Thornhill spoke coldly. She said these children were orphans with complicated backgrounds. She claimed they were better off here than in the outside world where they faced danger. She said the palace provided them food and shelter. But Thomas could see the truth. These children were prisoners. They were being kept hidden from the world for some dark purpose he did not yet understand. He asked what happened to them. Why were they here? What did the palace want with orphans? Lady Thornhill said that was enough questions. She had shown him everything to prove her power. Now he needed to make his final choice. Walk away and stay silent, or try to save these children and destroy his own family. But Lady Thornhill had made a mistake. She had assumed Thomas would be too afraid to act once he saw how big this was. She thought showing him multiple children would make him feel helpless. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Seeing those empty, hopeless faces made Thomas more determined than ever. He could not walk away from this. He would not. Thomas looked at his watch. His shift would end in 4 hours. By then, other guards would notice he was missing. Questions would be asked. He needed to use that time carefully. He told Lady Thornhill he needed to think about his decision. He asked if he could sit down for a moment. She agreed, seeming satisfied that she had broken his spirit. She sat in a chair by the door watching him. Thomas sat at the table with the children. Up close, he could see how scared they were. One little girl, maybe 7 years old, had tears running silently down her face. A boy with red hair kept his eyes fixed on the floor. They had given up hope long ago. Thomas leaned forward slightly and spoke very quietly. He asked the children their names. At first, nobody answered. Then the little girl whispered that her name was Sophie. The red-haired boy said his name was Oliver. One by one, the other children shared their names. Emma, like his daughter, Michael, and Lucy, who looked the oldest at 12. Lady Thornhill told them to be quiet. But Thomas ignored her. He asked the children how long they had been here. Sophie said she could not remember. Oliver said maybe a year. Lucy said she had been in the palace basement for 2 years. 2 years of this child's life, stolen and hidden in darkness. Thomas made a decision in that moment. He was going to save these children no matter what it cost him. He just needed to figure out how. Thomas sat with the children, his mind working fast to form a plan. Lady Thornhill watched him from her chair by the door, confident she had control of the situation. But she had underestimated him. Thomas had spent 12 years in the military and royal service. He knew how to stay calm under pressure. He knew how to wait for the right moment. He asked Lady Thornhill for water. He said he felt dizzy and needed a drink. She seemed annoyed but stood up and walked to a small cabinet in the corner. There was a sink there and some cups. While her back was turned for just a few seconds, Thomas slipped his hand into his pocket and pressed the emergency button on his radio 3 times. It was a silent alarm that would alert palace security that a guard was in distress. Lady Thornhill brought him the water. Thomas drank it slowly, buying time. He knew security would respond to the silent alarm, but they would go to his post first. When they found him missing, they would start searching. He just needed to keep Lady Thornhill talking until help arrived. He asked her how this operation started. Who created it? Lady Thornhill seemed almost proud as she began to explain. She said it started 25 years ago with a man named Lord Harrison, who was high up in the palace administration. He had discovered that certain orphans with no records or family could disappear without anyone noticing or caring. He began bringing them to the palace, keeping them hidden. Thomas felt sick as she talked. He asked what these children were used for. Lady Thornhill's face went cold. She said that was not his concern. But Thomas could guess. The bruises, the fear, the way these children had completely given up hope. They were being abused by powerful people who knew they could get away with it because nobody would miss these forgotten children. He asked if Lady Thornhill herself hurt the children. She looked offended. She said she was just the manager. She made sure the children stayed hidden and quiet. She made sure no one discovered them. Other people came down to visit the children. Important people whose names she would never speak. She was paid very well for her silence and cooperation. Thomas wanted to hit her. This woman had spent years helping terrible people hurt children. She acted like she was just doing a job, as if managing the abuse of innocence was no different than managing the palace household. He asked how she could sleep at night knowing what she was part of. Lady Thornhill shrugged. She said the world was cruel to children like these anyway. At least here they had food and shelter. Outside, they would probably die on the streets or fall into worse hands. She actually believed she was doing something reasonable. Her lack of guilt made Thomas's skin crawl. Upstairs, he knew security would be searching for him now. He needed to keep stalling. He told Lady Thornhill he wanted to know who else was involved. If he was going to keep this secret, he said he needed to know exactly how big it was and who he would be protecting. She thought about this for a moment, then began listing names. Minor nobles, a few politicians, some wealthy businessmen, all people with connections to the royal household as she talked. Thomas noticed Oliver, the red-haired boy, watching him carefully. The child had intelligent eyes. Thomas could see the boy was studying him, trying to figure out if this guard might actually help them. Thomas gave Oliver the smallest nod. The boy's eyes widened slightly. Suddenly, they heard sounds from upstairs. Footsteps and voices. Multiple people searching through the corridors. Lady Thornhill's face went pale. She stood up quickly and told Thomas to stay quiet. She moved to the door and locked it from the inside. She said if security found them, Thomas would tell them he got lost and she was helping him find his way back. He would say nothing about the children. Nothing. But Thomas had other plans. When the footsteps got close, he suddenly stood up and shouted as loud as he could. He yelled for help, saying he was down here and there were children being held prisoner. Lady Thornhill lunged at him, trying to cover his mouth, but Thomas was much stronger. He pushed her away and kept shouting. The footsteps thundered closer. Someone tried the door and found it locked. A voice commanded whoever was inside to open the door immediately. It was Captain Morrison, the head of palace security. Thomas recognized his voice. He shouted back, identifying himself and saying there was an emergency. Lady Thornhill pulled out her phone frantically, calling someone. But before she could speak, the door burst open. Captain Morrison had ordered his men to break it down. 3 security officers poured into the room with their weapons drawn. They stopped in shock when they saw the children. Captain Morrison was a man in his 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes. He looked from the children to Lady Thornhill to Thomas. He demanded to know what was happening. Thomas quickly explained everything. He told the captain about finding Daniel, about Lady Thornhill's threats, about the other children hidden down here. He spoke fast, getting all the facts out before anyone could stop him. Lady Thornhill tried to interrupt. She told Captain Morrison that Thomas was confused. She said he had abandoned his post and was making up stories. She claimed the children were part of an approved palace program for special orphans. But the children's condition told the real story. Captain Morrison looked at their bruises, their thin bodies, their terrified faces. He was not a fool. He ordered his men to secure Lady Thornhill. She screamed that he was making a mistake. She said powerful people would destroy all of them for this. She listed names, making threats. But Captain Morrison told her to be quiet. He radioed for medical assistance and for the head of palace security to come down immediately. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The children started crying. Not sad crying, but relief. They seemed unable to believe that someone was actually helping them. Sophie grabbed Thomas's hand and held it tight. Oliver stood up on shaky legs. Lucy, the oldest, covered her face and sobbed. These children had been trapped for so long that freedom seemed impossible. Medical staff arrived within minutes. They began checking the children, documenting injuries, providing comfort. Thomas stayed with them, especially Daniel, who was brought down from the storage room above. The boy would not let go of Thomas's uniform. He had finally found someone who protected him instead of hurting him. More officials arrived. The palace was going into crisis mode. Thomas was separated from the children and taken to a secure room. He was questioned for hours by different people. Security officers, police detectives, even representatives from the royal household. He told the same story over and over, leaving nothing out. He learned that Lady Thornhill had been arrested. Several other palace staff members who were involved had also been taken into custody. The investigation was expanding fast as they followed the evidence. The names Lady Thornhill mentioned were being contacted and questioned. Some of them were already fleeing the country. Thomas was told his career as a royal guard was over. He had broken too many protocols, left his post, entered restricted areas without authorization, but he did not care. He had saved 5 children from ongoing abuse: Daniel, Sophie, Oliver, Emma, Michael, and Lucy were free because he made the right choice instead of the easy one. Days later, Thomas sat in his small flat with Sarah. The story had not gone public yet. The palace was working hard to keep it quiet while the investigation continued. Sarah held his hand and told him she was proud of him. She said their children would grow up knowing their father was a hero who stood up when it mattered most. Thomas thought about those hollow eyes, looking at him in that basement room. He thought about how close he had come to walking away. If he had listened to Lady Thornhill's threats, those children might still be trapped down there, but he had not walked away. For once in his life, he had broken the rules for something more important than protocol. 3 weeks after Thomas discovered the children, the investigation had grown into one of the biggest scandals in palace history. Police had arrested 14 people so far. The list included Lady Thornhill, 3 other palace staff members, 2 businessmen, a minor noble, and several others. More arrests were expected as investigators dug deeper into the network of people who knew about or participated in abusing the hidden children. Thomas was sitting in a government office, meeting with Detective Inspector Sarah Chen. She had been assigned to lead the investigation. She was a serious woman in her 40s who specialized in crimes against children. She had been interviewing Thomas regularly to build the case against everyone involved. Detective Chen told Thomas that his testimony was crucial. Without him speaking up, the children might never have been found. She said forensic teams had examined the basement areas and found evidence that this had been going on for at least 20 years, possibly longer. They discovered old records hidden in locked cabinets, names of children who had been kept there and then disappeared. The investigation was now trying to track down what happened to those earlier victims. Thomas felt heavy grief when he heard this. 20 years of children suffering in the dark, while the palace functioned normally above them. How many lives had been destroyed? How many children never got the help Daniel and the others received? He asked Detective Chen if they would ever know the full truth. She said honestly, probably not. Many records had been destroyed over the years. Some of the people involved were now dead. But they would do everything possible to find answers and bring justice. She promised him that much. Then she gave him some good news. All 5 children he helped rescue were recovering in secure care facilities. They were receiving medical treatment, therapy, and proper food. Social workers were helping them adjust to normal life. Thomas asked if he could visit them. Detective Chen said yes, that had actually been arranged. She said Daniel especially had been asking about the guard who saved him. The boy wanted to thank Thomas properly. A visit was scheduled for the next day at the care facility where Daniel was staying. That night, Thomas could not sleep. He kept thinking about what he would say to Daniel. The boy had been through so much trauma. Thomas was just a guard who happened to find him. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had simply done what anyone should do when they see a child in danger. But he knew his visit would mean something to Daniel. It would show the boy that someone really did care what happened to him. The next morning, Sarah drove Thomas to the care facility in North London. It was a nice building with gardens and bright colors. Nothing like the dark basement where those children had been kept. A social worker named Patricia met them at the entrance. She was kind and gentle as she explained that Daniel was doing better each day, but still had nightmares and fear. She asked Thomas to be patient and understanding during the visit. They walked through comfortable hallways decorated with children's artwork. Patricia led them to a common room where Daniel was waiting. The boy was sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the garden. He was wearing clean clothes now and looked much healthier than 3 weeks ago. His hair was cut nicely, and his face was clean. But when he turned and saw Thomas, his eyes still held traces of that fear from the storage room. Thomas approached slowly and knelt down to be at Daniel's eye level. He said hello and asked how Daniel was doing. The boy stared at him for a long moment. Then suddenly Daniel stood up and hugged Thomas tightly. The boy started crying, saying thank you over and over. Thomas hugged him back, feeling his own eyes get wet. Sarah turned away to give them privacy, wiping her own tears. After Daniel calmed down, they sat together and talked. Daniel said the nightmares were bad, but his therapist was helping. He said the food here was good, and his room had a real bed with soft pillows. He said other children here were nice, and he was making friends. He was even going to start going to a real school soon, things he never thought he would have. Thomas asked if Daniel remembered anything about his family. The boy shook his head sadly. He said he had vague memories of a woman who might have been his mother, but nothing clear. Social workers were trying to find records, but Daniel had been taken when he was very young. He might never know where he came from. But Patricia said that was okay. They would help him build a new future instead of being trapped by his past. Before Thomas left, Daniel asked him something that broke his heart. The boy asked if Thomas would come visit him again. He said it would help him feel braver, knowing the guard was still watching out for him. Thomas promised he would visit as often as he could. He said Daniel was safe now, and nothing bad would happen to him again. Over the following months, Thomas did visit regularly. He also visited the other children he had helped save. Sophie was placed with a foster family who loved her and was slowly learning to smile again. Oliver was in a specialized care program for traumatized children and was making good progress. The others were all receiving the help they desperately needed. The legal cases moved forward slowly. Lady Thornhill refused to cooperate or show any remorse. She acted like she was the victim of an unfair prosecution. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. She would spend many years in prison for her crimes. The other defendants faced their own trials. Some pled guilty and cooperated with investigators. Others fought the charges. But one by one, justice was being served. The palace handled the scandal carefully. They released a formal statement acknowledging that serious crimes had occurred on palace grounds and promising full cooperation with law enforcement. They implemented new security measures and background checks for all staff. They established a review committee to make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. But the damage to the palace's reputation was severe. People were angry that such horrors had existed in a place that was supposed to represent dignity and honor. Thomas's role in exposing everything eventually became public. News reporters tracked him down and showed up at his flat. Camera crews waited outside his building. Everyone wanted to interview the royal guard who discovered the secret. But Thomas refused all interviews. He did not want fame or attention. He just wanted those children to heal and the guilty people to face justice. Some reporters called him a hero. Others wrote articles praising his courage. But Thomas felt uncomfortable with all the praise. He told Sarah that he had just done what was right. Any decent person would have done the same thing. She disagreed. She said many people would have walked away to protect themselves and their families. Thomas had risked everything for children he did not even know. That was the definition of heroism. The palace officially dismissed Thomas from his position as a royal guard. The termination letter cited multiple protocol violations and unauthorized actions. But privately, some palace officials thanked him. Captain Morrison shook his hand and said Thomas had more honor than anyone else he knew. The captain said he was sorry Thomas lost his job over doing the right thing. Thomas was not sure what to do next. Being a royal guard had been his entire adult life. It was his identity and purpose. Now that was gone. He felt lost for a while, unsure of his place in the world. He spent his days helping Sarah around the house, taking his children to school and visiting Daniel when he could. It was strange not having a uniform to put on each morning. Then something unexpected happened. A child protection charity called him. They had been following his story in the news. They offered him a job as a security consultant. They wanted someone who understood the importance of protecting vulnerable children. Someone who had proven they would stand up against powerful people when necessary. The salary was less than what he made as a guard, but the work felt meaningful. Thomas accepted the position. He began traveling to different care facilities and orphanages, reviewing their security procedures. He helped them create better systems to keep children safe. He trained staff on recognizing signs of abuse. He used everything he learned from the palace nightmare to help prevent similar situations elsewhere. It felt good to turn something horrible into something that could help other children, Daniel continued to recover and grow. By his 10th birthday, he was doing much better. He still had difficult days, but he was learning to live without constant fear. He was attending school and getting good grades. He had friends and hobbies. He was becoming just a regular kid, which was all he ever wanted. Thomas came to his birthday party at the care facility. Daniel introduced him to everyone as my friend who saved me. The trial of Lady Thornhill finally happened after months of delays. Thomas had to testify. He sat in the witness box and told the court everything he had seen and heard. Lady Thornhill sat at the defense table, refusing to look at him. She showed no emotion as Thomas described finding Daniel, the other children in the basement, and her threats against his family. The prosecutor asked Thomas why he chose to help despite those threats. He answered simply that leaving those children there was never an option he could live with. The jury took only 3 hours to reach a verdict, guilty on all charges. Lady Thornhill was sentenced to 22 years in prison. She would be an old woman when she got out, if she survived that long. Other defendants received their own sentences. The businessman who had been most involved got 30 years. The minor noble fled the country and was still being sought by international authorities. But most of the network had been dismantled. The children slowly rebuilt their lives. Sophie's foster parents eventually adopted her permanently. She found a forever home where she was loved and protected. Oliver improved enough to be placed in a regular group home with other children his age. Emma found a distant aunt who took her in. Michael and Lucy were still in care facilities, but were making progress. And Daniel continued to thrive, surprising everyone with his resilience. 2 years after that terrible day, Thomas received a letter. It was from Daniel. The boy was 12 now, and his handwriting had improved with proper schooling. He wrote that he wanted Thomas to know how his life had turned out. He was doing well in school, especially in math and science. He had joined a football team and made the squad. He had real friends who knew nothing about his past. He was just a normal kid living a normal life. But Daniel wrote that he would never forget being trapped in that dark storage room. He said he had given up hope that day, believing no one would ever find him or care. Then he heard footsteps and saw Thomas in his red uniform. In that moment, Daniel wrote, he learned that good people really did exist, that someone would risk everything to protect a child they did not know. That lesson, he said, had changed how he saw the world and himself. Thomas kept Daniel's letter in his wallet. He read it whenever he needed to remember why he had given up his career and reputation. The words reminded him that some choices were bigger than jobs or money or safety. Some choices defined who you were as a person. He had made the right choice that day, and nothing could change that. His work with the child protection charity grew and expanded. Thomas became their head of security operations. He trained people across the country on keeping children safe. He developed new protocols that were adopted by care facilities nationwide. He spoke at conferences about recognizing institutional abuse and having the courage to report it. His experience at the palace made him an expert that everyone wanted to consult. Sarah was proud of the man her husband had become. She told him that losing the palace job was the best thing that ever happened to him. Now, he was doing work that truly mattered. He was saving children every day by making the places they lived safer. Emma and James grew up knowing their father was someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. They learned values that would guide them throughout their lives. The palace scandal faded from news headlines over time. Other stories took over the front pages. But the changes Thomas set in motion continued. New laws were passed requiring better oversight of institutions that housed children. Background checks became more thorough. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. The palace itself underwent major reforms in how it managed staff and monitored restricted areas. The old networks of secrets and silence were broken apart. 3 years after the rescue, Thomas got a phone call from Patricia, the social worker who had first introduced him to Daniel. She had exciting news. Daniel was being adopted. A couple who had been fostering him for 6 months wanted to make it permanent. They were good people with stable jobs and a nice home. They loved Daniel, and he loved them. The adoption would be finalized next month. Patricia said Daniel wanted Thomas to be there. The boy considered Thomas's family, even though they were not related by blood. The adoption ceremony would be small and private, but Daniel insisted that Thomas had to attend. Without him, Daniel said, none of this would have been possible. Thomas agreed immediately. He would not miss it for anything. The adoption took place on a sunny morning in June. Thomas and Sarah attended, along with Daniel's new parents, some social workers, and a judge. Daniel wore a nice suit and could not stop smiling. When the judge signed the final papers, Daniel officially became Daniel Wilson. He had a family, a home, a real future. Thomas watched from his seat, feeling overwhelming happiness for this brave boy who had survived so much. After the ceremony, Daniel ran over to Thomas and hugged him. The boy said thank you again, just like he had in that first visit. But this time, there were no tears, just pure joy. Daniel introduced Thomas to his new parents, Mark and Jennifer Wilson. They thanked Thomas for saving their son. They said they had read everything about what happened and were amazed by his courage. They promised to give Daniel the best life possible. Thomas told them they did not need to thank him. He said Daniel was an incredible kid who deserved every good thing coming to him. He told Daniel's new parents how lucky they were to have such a special son. Daniel beamed with pride. This was a boy who had been trapped in darkness, believing he had no value or future. Now he stood in sunlight with people who loved him, ready to begin a real life. The other children Thomas had saved also found their paths forward. Sophie excelled in her new school and developed a passion for art. Her adoptive parents supported her talents, and she began winning local competitions. Oliver worked through his trauma with dedicated therapists and eventually was placed with a foster family who specialized in helping troubled children. Emma reconnected with extended family and built relationships that had been lost. Michael and Lucy both found foster homes that gave them the stability and care they needed. Not all of them recovered easily. Some struggled with trust issues and nightmares for years. But they were all safe now. They all had people looking out for them. They all had chances at normal childhoods and futures. That was what Thomas had given them when he chose to step through that open door instead of calling it in. From his post, Thomas sometimes thought about that moment. What if he had followed protocol? What if he had just radioed in the open door and stayed at his post? Someone else would have investigated. Maybe they would have found the children. Maybe they would have walked past that storage room and never heard Daniel's crying. He would never know. But he knew his decision to act immediately, to break the rules, had made all the difference. His former colleagues from the palace sometimes contacted him. Some said they admired what he did. Others said he should have followed proper channels and let security handle it. Thomas did not argue with them. Everyone had to make their own choices about what mattered most. For him, saving those children was worth any cost. Captain Morrison retired from palace security and stayed in touch with Thomas. The captain said the palace was a better place now because of what Thomas exposed. The old culture of secrets and blind loyalty had been challenged. People were more willing to question things and speak up when something seemed wrong. It was a small silver lining to a terrible situation. 5 years after the rescue, Thomas was invited to speak at a national conference on child protection. He stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of social workers, care providers, law enforcement officers, and advocates. He told them his story. He described finding Daniel, facing Lady Thornhill's threats, and deciding that some things were worth risking everything for. He told them that evil could hide anywhere, even in places that seemed respectable and trustworthy. That institutional abuse happened because good people chose to look away or stay quiet. That protecting children required courage to challenge authority when necessary. That following rules was important, but not more important than protecting innocent lives. The audience gave him a standing ovation. After his speech, dozens of people came up to thank him and share their own stories of speaking up or wishing they had. Thomas realized his experience had become bigger than just him. It had become a lesson about moral courage that inspired others to act when they encountered wrongdoing. Daniel attended that conference. He was 15 now, a confident teenager, doing well in school. He sat in the front row while Thomas spoke, nodding along with the stories he knew so well. Afterward, Daniel joined Thomas on stage. The conference organizers asked if Daniel wanted to say anything. The boy took the microphone. His voice was steady and strong. He said that 5 years ago he was locked in a dark room believing he would die there. He said he had been hurt by people who were supposed to protect children. He said he had lost all hope that anyone cared about forgotten kids like him. Then one day, a guard in a red uniform heard him crying. That guard made a choice that saved his life and the lives of other children. Daniel said Thomas taught him that one person could make a difference, that doing the right thing mattered even when it was dangerous or costly, that there were still heroes in the world, willing to stand up against evil. He said he would spend his life trying to be like Thomas, helping people who could not help themselves. The audience applauded again, many wiping away tears. Thomas looked at Daniel, standing tall and confident, speaking to hundreds of people about hope and courage. This was the same terrified boy who could barely whisper his name in that storage room. The transformation was incredible. Thomas realized that saving Daniel had not just given the boy a future, it had given him purpose and direction. It had shown him the kind of man he wanted to become. Years continued to pass. Thomas grew older, and his own children became adults. Emma became a social worker, inspired by her father's example. James joined the police force, wanting to protect vulnerable people. They both carried forward the lesson they learned from watching their father choose courage over comfort. Thomas eventually retired from his security work, but continued volunteering. He mentored young people interested in child protection. He consulted on difficult cases where institutional abuse was suspected. He never stopped trying to make the world safer for children who had no one else to protect them. Daniel graduated high school with honors and went to university to study social work. He wanted to help other children who had been through trauma. He said Thomas inspired him to turn his pain into purpose. He would use his own experience to understand and help others who suffered. On the 10th anniversary of the rescue, Thomas received a package. Inside was a framed photo of all 5 children he had saved. They had tracked each other down and gotten together for a reunion. Sophie, Oliver, Emma, Michael, Lucy, and Daniel stood together smiling at the camera. On the back, they had all signed their names with messages thanking Thomas for giving them their lives back. Thomas hung the photo in his home office where he could see it every day. When people asked about it, he would tell the story of the day he broke protocol to save children from darkness. He would explain that following rules was important, but knowing when to break them was what defined true character. He would say that anyone in his position should have done the same thing, even though he knew that was not true. Not everyone would have risked everything for strangers. But Thomas Whitaker had, and because of that choice, made in a moment of crisis, 5 children grew up to live full lives instead of remaining trapped in suffering. That legacy was worth more than any career, any reputation, or any reward. It was the legacy of a man who stood in front of an open door, heard a child crying, and chose to walk into darkness to bring them back to light. That choice changed everything, not just for those children, but for everyone who heard the story and learned that one person really could make a difference. When they had the courage to try,